I discovered my wife's secret therapy documentation that turned me into a villain. I exposed her manipulation and ended our marriage forever now. Someone shows you exactly how little you deserve it. That's what happened when I found my wife's little project, a detailed documentation of every single thing she considered wrong with me, written specifically for her therapist. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed. She had left for her weekly therapy session, something she'd been doing for about 6 months now. She always came back with new theories about our relationship, new ways to analyze what I was doing wrong. I thought she was working on herself, getting better. Turns out she was building a case against me. I was looking for our warranty papers in her desk drawer when I found it, a thick, leather-bound notebook with her neat handwriting covering page after page. The title on the first page made my blood run cold: Behavioral Documentation, Session Notes, and Observations. I opened it, thinking maybe it was just general therapy notes. Boy, was I wrong. This was a detailed catalog of my supposed failures as a husband. Every conversation we'd had, every decision I'd made, every habit I had, all twisted into evidence of my inadequacy. Subject consistently dismisses my concerns about household management, one entry read. Shows classic signs of emotional unavailability when I try to discuss relationship improvements. Possible narcissistic tendencies when he prioritizes work commitments over my needs. Subject. She was calling me the subject, like I was some kind of experiment she was conducting. I kept reading, and it got worse. She had documented everything from how I loaded the dishwasher to how I responded to her complaints about my friends. But here's the thing, she had twisted every single event. That time I worked late to finish a project, she wrote it down as prioritizing career over family obligations. When I suggested we split the grocery shopping to save time, attempting to avoid responsibility for household planning. The worst part wasn't just the documentation itself. It was how she had twisted our conversations. She would write things like, when confronted about his dismissive behavior, subject became defensive and refused to acknowledge impact on my emotional well-being. I remembered those conversations differently. She would criticize something I did. I would explain my reasoning, and she would accuse me of not listening to her feelings. There were dozens of entries dating back months. She had been watching me, analyzing me, documenting every interaction like I was some kind of case study. And according to her notes, she was sharing all of this with her therapist every week. I sat there for a long time, reading through page after page of her twisted version of our marriage. She had documented arguments that never happened, interpreted innocent comments as attacks, and created a narrative where I was the villain in every scenario. But what really got me was the clinical tone. She wasn't writing about her husband, whom she loved but was having problems with. She was writing about a subject she was studying, a problem she was trying to solve with professional help. I heard her car pull into the driveway and quickly put the notebook back exactly where I found it. When she walked in, she had that satisfied look she always got after therapy sessions. "How was your session?" I asked, like I always did. "Really productive," she said, settling into her chair with a cup of tea. "We talked about communication patterns and how to address problematic behaviors in relationships." Problematic behaviors. I almost laughed. She was sitting there talking about her therapy session, where she had just spent an hour dissecting my character with a professional, and she was calling my behaviors problematic. "That's great," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Anything specific you want to work on together?" "Well," she said, and I could see her shifting into what I now recognized as her analytical mode. "We discussed how defensive responses can shut down productive conversations. Maybe we could work on that." I nodded, playing along. "Anything else?" "Just general awareness of how our actions affect each other. Being more mindful of patterns that might be harmful to the relationship." The irony was incredible. She was talking about being mindful of harmful patterns, while she had been secretly documenting and psychoanalyzing me for months. But I kept my expression neutral, even interested. "That makes sense," I said. "I'm always open to improving things between us." She smiled, clearly pleased with my response. If only she knew what I was really thinking. I had discovered her secret weapon. Her carefully constructed narrative about our marriage. She thought she was building a case, creating evidence of my failures. What she didn't realize was that I had just discovered the rules of the game she was playing, and unlike her, I wasn't planning to play with a twisted version of reality. I was going to document the truth. That night, as she slept peacefully beside me, probably dreaming about her next therapy session, I lay awake thinking about what I had learned. My wife wasn't just unhappy with our marriage, she was systematically building a case against me, using professional validation to justify her perspective. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I could confront her directly, but that would just give her more material for her documentation. I could ignore it and hope things got better, but that seemed naive given what I had read. Or I could start documenting too. But unlike her, I would document what actually happened, not some twisted interpretation designed to make me look bad. If she wanted to play the documentation game, I could play it too. The difference was I would be documenting the truth. The next few days were like living in a completely different reality. Now that I knew what she was doing, I started seeing everything differently. Every conversation, every interaction, every seemingly innocent comment. I could practically see her mental notes being taken. She had therapy again the following Tuesday, and I watched her prepare for it like she was preparing for a business meeting. She would sit at the kitchen table beforehand, flipping through her notebook, adding little details, refining her observations. I pretended to be reading the news on my phone, but I was actually watching her work. "Did you remember to pick up milk yesterday?" she asked me that morning. "No, I forgot. I'll get it today after work." I watched her make a mental note. Sure enough, when I checked her notebook later that day, there it was. Subject demonstrates consistent pattern of forgetting household responsibilities despite repeated reminders. Shows lack of consideration for shared domestic obligations. The thing is, I had only forgotten milk once in the past month. But the way she wrote it, you would think I never contributed to household tasks. That's when I realized she wasn't just documenting selectively, she was actively distorting reality. I started keeping a small notebook of my own. Nothing fancy, just a simple record of actual events. When she asked me to pick up milk, when I forgot, when I remembered, when I did other household tasks she conveniently didn't document. Real events, real times, real context. The difference was striking. According to my notes, I had handled grocery shopping 12 times in the past month. According to her documentation, I had avoided grocery responsibilities and required constant reminders for basic household tasks. But the real revelation came when I started paying attention to how she interpreted our conversations. She would ask me something, I would give a straightforward answer, and somehow that became evidence of a character flaw. "How was work today?" she asked me one Wednesday evening. "Busy. We had a client meeting that ran long and I had to finish up some reports afterward. You seem stressed. Is everything okay?" "Just the usual work stuff. Nothing major." The next day, her notebook entry read, "Subject displays high stress levels but refuses to discuss emotional state. Demonstrates pattern of emotional withdrawal when facing professional challenges. Possible avoidance of vulnerability in relationship." I had told her exactly what was going on at work. She had asked if I was okay, and I had given her an honest answer. But somehow that became evidence that I was emotionally unavailable and avoiding vulnerability. That's when I realized what she was really doing. She wasn't documenting my behavior. She was creating a narrative. Every interaction was being filtered through a lens that made me look problematic, regardless of what actually happened. I started recording some of our conversations on my phone, not to use against her, but to make sure I wasn't going crazy. When you're constantly being told that your responses are defensive or dismissive, you start to question your own perception of reality. The recordings confirmed what I suspected. I was being reasonable, direct, and honest in our conversations. But she was interpreting everything I said as evidence of deeper problems. If I explained my point of view, I was being defensive. If I agreed with her, I was being dismissive. If I asked questions, I was challenging her feelings. She had created a system where I couldn't win. Every response I gave was automatically categorized as problematic behavior that needed to be addressed in therapy. Friday night, she came home from therapy with a new suggestion. "I've been thinking about our communication patterns," she said, settling into her analytical tone. "Maybe we should try scheduled check-ins. Set aside specific times to discuss how we're feeling about the relationship." "Okay," I said. "What would that look like?" "Well, we could sit down every Sunday evening and each share something that went well that week and something that could be improved." I almost laughed. She wanted to formalize the process of finding fault with me, but I played along. "That sounds reasonable. How long would these check-ins be?" "Maybe 30 minutes. Just enough time to really address any issues that come up." "And what if we don't have any issues to address?" She gave me a look that I now recognized as her preparing to document my response. There are always things that can be improved in a relationship, The goal is to be more aware of them. There it was. The assumption that there were always problems, always things that needed to be fixed. And based on her documentation, those problems were always mine. I agreed to the Sunday check-ins, but I also made a decision. I was going to start documenting these conversations too. Not her twisted interpretation of them, but what actually happened. Word for word if possible. Sunday came, and we had our first scheduled check-in. She had prepared notes, naturally. She started with what went well. I appreciated that you helped with the dishes on Wednesday. Then she moved to what could be improved. I think we could work on being more present during conversations. Sometimes it feels like you're not fully engaged when I'm trying to share something important. Can you give me a specific example? I asked. Well, last Tuesday when I was telling you about my conversation with my sister, you seemed distracted. I remembered that conversation. I had been listening, but I was also making dinner at the same time. I had asked questions about what her sister had said and given advice when she asked for it. I was listening, I said. I was just multitasking with dinner. But it felt like you weren't fully present for me. I understand that feeling, but I was engaged in the conversation. I asked questions and responded to what you were saying. I could see her making mental notes. Later, when I checked her notebook, there it was. During check-in, subject became defensive when confronted about inattentive behavior, refused to acknowledge impact on partner's emotional needs, insisted on being right rather than understanding feelings. But I had my own notes. I had written down exactly what was said, when it was said, and how the conversation actually went. I had been reasonable, I had asked for clarification, and I had explained my perspective without being defensive. The gap between reality and her documentation was becoming impossible to ignore. She wasn't just documenting my behavior, she was creating a fictional version of me that fit whatever narrative she wanted to present to her therapist. That night, I made a decision. If she wanted to document our marriage, fine, but I was going to document it too, and unlike her fantasy version, mine was going to be based on facts, not interpretations designed to make me look bad. I started keeping detailed records of everything. Conversations, activities, who did what around the house, how conflicts were resolved, real documentation with dates, times, and context. No editorializing, no psychological analysis, just facts. What I discovered was that I wasn't the problem she was making me out to be. Was I perfect? No. But I wasn't the emotionally unavailable, defensive, problematic husband she was describing to her therapist. I was just married to someone who had decided that I was the problem and was determined to find evidence to support that conclusion, regardless of what actually happened. The question was, what was I going to do with this information? By the third week, she had become insufferable. Armed with her weekly therapy sessions and her growing collection of insights, she started treating our house like her personal psychology laboratory. And I was the unwilling test subject. I've been learning about attachment styles, she announced one evening, cornering me in the kitchen while I was making coffee. And I think you might have an avoidant attachment pattern. I looked at her, measuring my response carefully. Everything I said would end up in that notebook. What makes you think that? Well, when I try to have deep conversations about our relationship, you tend to change the subject or find something else to do. That's classic avoidant behavior. When have I done that? Just last week, when I wanted to talk about our future goals, you said you needed to check your email. I remembered that conversation differently. She had started talking about our future goals at 11 o'clock at night on a weeknight when I had an early meeting the next morning. I had asked if we could continue the conversation over the weekend when we had more time, but apparently that was avoidant behavior. I suggested we talk about it when we had more time to really focus on it, I said. See, you're being defensive about it right now. That's exactly what avoidant people do. There it was. The trap. If I explained my side, I was being defensive. If I didn't respond, I was being avoidant. She had created a system where any response I gave proved her point. I started noticing this pattern in every conversation. She would make an observation about my behavior, I would respond normally, and she would analyze my response as further evidence of whatever psychological issue she had decided I had that week. I think we should implement some boundaries around screen time, she said the next day. I've been reading about how technology affects relationship intimacy. What kind of boundaries? No phones during dinner, no checking work emails after 8 o'clock in the evening, and maybe one evening a week where we don't use any devices at all. The rules sounded reasonable enough, but I could see where this was heading. And if I need to check something urgent for work? That's exactly the kind of thinking that prioritizes work over our relationship. You're proving my point about your avoidant tendencies. I had asked a practical question about a work emergency, and somehow that became psychological evidence. But I decided to test something. You're right, those boundaries sound good. Let's try them. She looked slightly disappointed that I hadn't argued. Later, I found her notebook entry, subject agreed to boundaries but showed reluctance through questioning. Possible passive-aggressive compliance rather than genuine commitment to relationship improvement. I couldn't win. If I disagreed, I was being defensive. If I agreed, I was being passive-aggressive. She had created a narrative framework where every response I gave was pathological. But the real problem started when she began implementing her therapeutic insights as house rules. She posted a schedule on the refrigerator outlining our new relationship improvement routine, daily check-ins, weekly deeper conversations, monthly relationship assessments. She had turned our marriage into a full-time therapy project. I think we should start practicing active listening, she announced during one of our forced daily check-ins. When one person is talking, the other person has to repeat back what they heard before responding. Okay, I said, because what else could I say? So, let me start. I feel like you've been emotionally distant lately, and I need more emotional connection in our relationship. I repeated back what she said as instructed. Now you share something. I feel like we've been analyzing our relationship so much that we've stopped actually enjoying it. So what I'm hearing is that you think working on our relationship is a problem. Is that right? That's not what I said. I said that constant analysis might be preventing us from actually connecting naturally. But you see how that sounds dismissive of my needs for deeper connection. Every conversation became a therapy session. Every interaction was filtered through whatever psychological concept she had learned that week. She had turned our home into a clinical environment where I was constantly being evaluated and found lacking. The worst part was how she used her therapy sessions to validate her behavior. My therapist says that resistance to relationship work is a common defense mechanism, she would say. Or, according to my therapist, partners who avoid emotional intimacy often deflect by criticizing the process. She had found a professional who was apparently confirming all of her theories about my psychological defects. Every Tuesday, she would come home with new ammunition, new ways to analyze and categorize my responses. I started paying more attention to how she prepared for these sessions. She would spend Sunday evenings reviewing her notebook, adding details, cross-referencing events. She approached therapy like a lawyer preparing for trial, with me as the defendant. But here's what she didn't know. I had been doing my own research. I had been reading about documentation in relationships, about gaslighting, about psychological manipulation, and I had been keeping my own detailed records of what was actually happening. While she was documenting her interpretation of my behavior, I was documenting her actual behavior. The way she twisted conversations, the way she set up no-win scenarios, the way she used psychological terminology to shut down any disagreement. I had also started researching therapists, not to find one for myself, but to understand what kind of professional would validate the kind of documentation she was doing. What I learned was interesting. Most ethical therapists would be concerned about a client who was this focused on analyzing and documenting their partner's behavior. They would encourage the client to focus on their own responses and growth, not on building a case against their spouse. But some therapists, especially those who weren't very experienced or who had their own biases, might inadvertently encourage this kind of behavior by validating the client's perspective without challenging it. I started wondering what exactly she was telling her therapist. Was she presenting a balanced view of our relationship, or was she presenting the same twisted narrative that was in her notebook? The breaking point came when she announced her latest insight from therapy. "I've been discussing your resistance to emotional intimacy," she said, "and we think it might be helpful if you started seeing a therapist too. We, my therapist and I, think that couples therapy might not be effective until you address your individual issues with emotional availability." So now her therapist was making recommendations about my mental health based on her client's biased documentation. This wasn't therapy anymore. This was strategic planning. "What kind of individual issues?" I asked. "Your defensive responses, your avoidant behavior, your resistance to relationship work. All of these could be addressed in individual therapy before we work on couples issues." I looked at her sitting there with her notebook, her therapeutic vocabulary, and her complete certainty that I was the problem. She had created an elaborate system to prove that everything wrong with our marriage was my fault, and she had found a professional to validate that system. I'll think about it, I said. That night, I made a decision. I had enough documentation of my own to see the pattern clearly. She wasn't trying to improve our relationship. She was trying to build a case that I was psychologically defective, and she was using a therapist to validate that case. If she wanted to play the documentation game, I could play it too. But I wasn't going to document twisted interpretations of reality. I was going to document the truth, and I was going to find a professional who could help me understand what was really happening in my marriage. The next morning, I called a lawyer. The lawyer was a middle-aged woman who specialized in family law. I brought my documentation, the real documentation, not the twisted fantasy version my wife had been creating. She listened as I explained the situation, occasionally raising an eyebrow as I described the extent of my wife's behavior. "This is concerning," she said after reviewing my notes. "What you're describing could be considered psychological manipulation. The documentation alone shows a pattern of systematic undermining. Is this normal in marriages that are struggling?" Struggling couples argue. They disagree. They have problems. They don't typically conduct covert psychological evaluations of each other. This is something else entirely. She was right. This wasn't a marriage problem. This was a systematic campaign to prove I was defective. And now my wife was escalating. I came home that evening to find her waiting for me with a serious expression. "We need to talk," she said, patting the couch beside her. "About what?" "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about you getting individual therapy. I think it's really important that you follow through on that. You said you would think about it, but thinking about it isn't the same as doing it. And honestly, your reluctance to get help is part of the problem." I sat down, keeping my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "Well, I've been sharing our conversations with my therapist, and she's concerned about some of the patterns she's seeing. She thinks your resistance to therapy might indicate deeper issues." There it was. She was now using her therapist's professional opinion as a weapon. What kind of deeper issues? Possible narcissistic tendencies. People with those traits often resist therapy because they can't acknowledge their own problems. I almost laughed. According to her logic, if I went to therapy, it proved I had problems. If I didn't go to therapy, it proved I had worse problems. Another perfect no-win scenario. And if I disagree with that assessment, that would just prove the point. Narcissists always think they're right and everyone else is wrong. She had created the ultimate trap. Any response that wasn't complete submission to her psychological diagnosis was evidence that the diagnosis was correct. But I had been preparing for this moment. "That's interesting," I said calmly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How long have you been documenting my behavior for your therapist?" The question caught her off guard. I could see her trying to figure out how I knew about the documentation. "What do you mean?" "I mean the notebook where you write down everything I do and say, then analyze it for psychological problems. How long have you been doing that?" Her face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The leather notebook in your desk drawer. Behavioral documentation, session notes, and observations." Ring a bell? She was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to decide how to handle this. Finally, she shifted into damage control mode. "That's just notes to help me remember things for therapy. Everyone does that. Everyone documents their spouse's behavior like a case study. Everyone calls their husband the subject. You went through my private things. I found it by accident. But that's not the point. The point is that you've been systematically documenting everything I do and twisting it to make me look psychologically defective. I'm not twisting anything. I'm documenting concerning behaviors that affect our relationship. Concerning behaviors like forgetting to buy milk once, or asking practical questions about your suggestions." She was getting defensive now, which was ironic given how often she accused me of that. "Those are just examples of larger patterns." "What larger patterns?" "That I work hard, that I ask questions when you make demands, that I don't automatically agree with every psychological theory you bring home from therapy? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're being defensive and dismissive right now." I stood up, done with this conversation. "You know what? You're right. I am being defensive. When someone spends months secretly documenting my behavior and sharing it with a stranger to build a case that I'm psychologically defective, I get defensive. Most people would. She's not a stranger. She's a professional. She's a stranger to me. And she's making judgments about my mental health based on your biased documentation. That's not therapy. That's character assassination." My wife stood up too, clearly angry that her strategy wasn't working. "Fine. If you won't get help voluntarily, maybe we need to take a break from this marriage. There it was. The threat. Get psychological help for problems I didn't have or lose my marriage. But she had miscalculated. I wasn't the desperate, psychologically defective husband she had been documenting. I was someone who had been preparing for this moment. Maybe we do, I said calmly. She clearly wasn't expecting that response. What? Maybe we do need to take a break. In fact, maybe we need to separate permanently. You don't mean that. I absolutely mean that. I've spent months being analyzed, documented, and psychologically diagnosed by someone who decided I was the problem before she even started looking for evidence. I'm done. But you can't just give up on our marriage. I'm not giving up on our marriage. Our marriage ended when you decided to turn it into a psychological research project. I walked toward the door, then turned back. Oh, and one more thing. That documentation you've been keeping? I've been keeping my own, real documentation, not twisted interpretations. If you want to make this legal, bring it on. Her face went white. For the first time in months, she didn't have a psychological theory or therapeutic insight to throw at me. She just had the reality that her secret weapon wasn't so secret anymore. And unlike her fantasy documentation, mine would hold up in court. The next morning, she tried to backtrack. I found her sitting at the kitchen table with coffee in her most apologetic expression. I think we both said things we didn't mean last night, she began. I meant every word. But we can work through this. Maybe we just need to communicate better. I poured my own coffee and sat across from her. You want to communicate better? Let's communicate. Let's talk about how you've been secretly documenting my behavior for months and sharing it with a therapist to build a case that I'm psychologically defective. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? She shifted uncomfortably. I was just trying to understand the patterns in our relationship. My therapist suggested I keep track of interactions so we could identify problem areas. Show me where in your notebook you documented anything positive I did. Show me where you wrote about your own behavior that might be problematic. Silence. You can't, because it doesn't exist. Your entire documentation project was designed to prove I was the problem. That's not true. I walked to my office and returned with my own notebook. This is my documentation. Want to see the difference? I opened it to a random page and read, Tuesday, March 15th. She asked me to pick up her prescription. I stopped by the pharmacy after work and brought it home. She thanked me but didn't write this down anywhere. I flipped to another page. Thursday, March 17th. During dinner, she criticized how I loaded the dishwasher. I explained my method but didn't argue. She wrote in her notebook that I was defensive about household criticism, but didn't mention that I actually reloaded it the way she preferred. Her face was getting paler with each entry I read. Friday, March 18th. She came home upset about a work situation. I listened for 30 minutes and offered support. No mention of this in her therapeutic documentation, but she did write about how I seemed distracted when I asked one clarifying question. I closed the notebook. Want me to keep going? I have 3 months of this. You were spying on me. I was documenting reality. You know, the thing you were supposed to be doing. She tried a different approach. Look, maybe we both made mistakes. Maybe we can start fresh. Start fresh? You spent months building a psychological case against me. You told a therapist I have narcissistic tendencies. You threatened to leave me if I didn't get therapy for problems you invented. And now you want to start fresh? People can change. You're right. I have changed. I'm no longer willing to be analyzed, documented, and psychologically diagnosed by someone who decided I was defective before she even started looking for evidence. She was quiet for a moment, then tried her last card. What about counseling? Real couples counseling, not individual therapy. With what counselor? The one you've been sharing your biased documentation with for months? The one who already thinks I have psychological problems based on your twisted version of our marriage? We could find a different one. No. The finality in my voice seemed to hit her. You're really going to throw away our entire marriage over this? I'm not throwing anything away. You destroyed our marriage when you decided to turn me into a psychological case study instead of treating me like your husband. But we could fix this. I looked at her sitting there, still trying to manipulate the situation, still trying to find an angle that would let her maintain control. You know what the real problem is? Even now, you're not apologizing for what you did. You're trying to figure out how to manage the situation. I am apologizing. No, you're not. You're doing damage control. A real apology would acknowledge that you spent months systematically undermining my character and sharing intimate details. of our marriage with a stranger to build a case against me. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. I called a lawyer yesterday. The words hit her like a physical blow. You what? I called a family lawyer, showed her your documentation and mine. Want to know what she said? She didn't answer. She said what you did could be considered psychological manipulation. She said keeping secret documentation on a spouse for the purpose of building a case against them is concerning behavior. She said most judges would find your notebook very interesting in a divorce proceeding. You can't be serious about divorce. Watch me. For the first time in months, she had no psychological theory to fall back on, no therapeutic insight, no professional validation, just the reality that her systematic campaign to prove I was defective had backfired spectacularly. I could show the therapist your documentation too, she said weakly. Go ahead. Show her how you twisted every interaction to make me look bad, and then show her my documentation of what actually happened. Let's see which version holds up to professional scrutiny. She was beaten, and she knew it. The weapon she had spent months crafting had turned into evidence against her. So what happens now? She asked. Now you get to experience what it's like to have someone document your behavior and share it with a professional. Except in my case, that professional is a lawyer, and the documentation is accurate. I stood up to leave for work. Oh, and cancel your therapy session this week. You're going to need that money for your own lawyer. 2 weeks later, she was singing a completely different tune. Her lawyer had reviewed both sets of documentation and delivered some harsh truths about her position. Apparently, systematically documenting your spouse's behavior for psychological ammunition doesn't look good in family court. Can we talk? She asked when I came home from work. She was sitting at the same kitchen table where she used to plan her therapy sessions, but this time she looked defeated. About what? About maybe working this out without lawyers. I sat down, curious to see where this was going. What changed your mind about divorce? My attorney said that my documentation could be seen as evidence of psychological manipulation. She said judges don't like it when one spouse treats the other like a research subject. Interesting. What else did she say? She said your documentation shows a pattern of you being reasonable and me being controlling. The word hung in the air. After months of being analyzed and diagnosed, she was finally getting a taste of professional evaluation herself. She also said that sharing intimate marriage details with a therapist for the purpose of building a case against my spouse could be considered a breach of marital privacy. And she strongly recommended I try to resolve this without going to court. I leaned back in my chair. So now that a professional has looked at the actual facts instead of your twisted version, suddenly you want to work things out? It wasn't twisted. I was just trying to understand our relationship problems. By secretly documenting everything I did and sharing it with a stranger to prove I was psychologically defective. That's not understanding relationship problems. That's building a case. She was quiet for a moment. Maybe I got carried away with the therapy. Maybe you turned our marriage into a psychological research project. You documented everything I did wrong and nothing I did right. You used therapeutic terminology to shut down every conversation. You threatened to leave me if I didn't get therapy for problems you invented. I know it looks bad. It doesn't just look bad, it is bad. And now that your lawyer told you it could backfire in court, suddenly you want to reconcile. That's not the only reason. What's the other reason? Because I realized I might have been wrong about some things. Might have been wrong. Even now, she couldn't fully admit what she had done. Here's what's going to happen, I said. You're going to stop seeing that therapist who validated your psychological campaign against me. You're going to destroy that notebook and never document my behavior again. And you're going to acknowledge that you spent months psychologically manipulating me instead of actually working on our marriage. If you do all that, then maybe we can have an actual conversation about whether this marriage is worth saving. Not a therapy session, not a psychological evaluation, just two people talking honestly. I can do that. Can you? Because for months, every conversation we had was filtered through whatever psychological theory you learned that week.
Can you actually talk to me like I'm your husband instead of a case study?
She nodded, but I could see her struggling with the concept. Here's your first test, I said. Tell me one thing you did wrong in this situation, not something you might have gotten carried away with, or something that looks bad. Tell me one specific thing you did that was wrong. She thought for a long moment. I documented your behavior without telling you. And I shared private information about our marriage with my therapist. And I twisted some of the events to fit my perspective. Some of the events? Most of the events. And I used therapy as a weapon against you instead of actually working on myself. Finally, a real acknowledgement of what she had done. Now tell me why you did it. Because I thought you were the problem. Why did you think that? She was quiet for a long time. Because it was easier than looking at my own behavior. There it was. The truth she had been avoiding for months with all her psychological theories and therapeutic insights. So what happens now? She asked. Now you get to decide if you want to be married to me or if you want to be married to the psychological case study you created in that notebook. I want to be married to you. Then act like it. Stop analyzing me, stop documenting me, stop trying to fix me. If you have problems with our marriage, talk to me about them directly like an adult, not like a therapist. I can do that. We'll see. The truth is, I wasn't sure our marriage could survive what she had done. Months of systematic psychological manipulation don't just disappear because someone gets legal advice. But I was willing to find out if the woman I married was still in there somewhere, buried under all the therapeutic jargon and amateur psychology. But one thing was certain, I would never again be anyone's research subject. I had documented the truth, and the truth had set me free. Whether she could handle that freedom remained to be seen. The notebook was gone. The therapist was history, and the psychological campaign was over. For the first time in months, I was just a husband talking to his wife, not a subject being analyzed by his evaluator. And if she couldn't handle that, well, I had excellent documentation of exactly what happened.